Thurgood Marshall spent his career dismantling the legal architecture of racial oppression, but the ancestry his own DNA revealed places him at every brutal intersection that built it. He descended from enslaved Africans, from the European men who almost certainly enslaved them, and from indigenous lineage that no family record had ever recorded. Understanding where that ancestry came from and what it means changes the depth at which his life's work can be understood. Before we dive in, comment where you are watching from and click subscribe. Thurgood Marshall was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1908 into a family that occupied a specific and complicated position in early 20th century Black America. His father, William Marshall, worked as a railroad porter and later as a steward at an all-white gentlemen's club. That employment required deference in public and demanded dignity in private. His mother, Norma, was a school teacher, educated and quietly ambitious for her children. Together they raised Thurgood in a household that understood exactly where the boundaries were and expected him to find a way past them. Baltimore in that era was a city of enforced contradictions. It sat below the Mason-Dixon line in practice, if not in geography, and its Black residents navigated a racial order that was rigid, codified, and occasionally violent. Marshall grew up watching his father argue politics and law at the dinner table with a ferocity that left an impression. William Marshall had no legal training, but he believed in the power of argument, and he passed that belief directly to his son. What Marshall inherited from his family was more visible than his ancestry. He was lighter skinned than many of his peers, a fact that carried uncomfortable social meaning in a community where complexion had long been used to sort and divide. Marshall never dwelt on it publicly, but he was not blind to it. He once remarked with characteristic dry humor that somewhere in his family tree sat some of the meanest slave owners in history. The comment was delivered as a joke. It was not entirely one. The family name itself was almost certainly taken from an enslaver. This was not unusual. Across the American South and the border states, formerly enslaved people emerged from the Civil War carrying the surnames of the men who had owned them, with no documentary record connecting them to anything before. The Marshalls before William, before his father, before his grandfather, existed in the historical record as property rather than people. Their names, origins, and individual stories had been replaced by numbers in a ledger. That erasure was the inheritance Marshall carried into the law. Before DNA, no amount of research could see through it. For most African American families, the documentary record does not simply thin out as it moves backward through time. It stops. The 1870 federal census was the first in which free Black Americans were listed by name, by age, and by household. Before that, the census recorded enslaved people only as numbers beneath the name of the person who claimed to own them. No surnames, no family relationships, no indication of where they had come from or who they had been before they became someone else's property. Historians call this the genealogical wall. It is not a metaphor. It is a structural feature of the archive, built by the legal and bureaucratic machinery of slavery itself. Plantation records, where they survive at all, list enslaved people as line items in an inventory, alongside livestock and equipment, with just enough detail to establish financial value and nothing more. The records that might have preserved family connections, birth origins, or ethnic identities were never created, because creating them served no purpose within the logic of the institution. Marshall's family lines ran directly into that wall. The Marshalls on his father's side and the Williamses on his mother's side could be traced with reasonable confidence through the decades after the Civil War, through Reconstruction, and into the early 20th century. But at the threshold of 1870, the paper trail ended. What lay behind it, the specific people, the specific places, the specific circumstances that had produced his family, was invisible to conventional research. Oral tradition preserved fragments. Families across the South maintained memories of names, of home places, of ancestral figures described in general terms, but never fully documented. Marshall's family was no different, but oral history however carefully carried, cannot confirm ethnic origin, cannot identify a biological father absent from every official record, and cannot penetrate the deliberate silence that slavery imposed on the lives of the people it consumed. The wall held for generations. Every researcher who approached Marshall's ancestry through documents alone eventually reached the same boundary and stopped. The question of what lay on the other side remained open, and it remained that way until a different kind of evidence became available. Genetic genealogy does not operate as a single test producing a single answer. It draws on several distinct forms of DNA analysis, each designed to answer a different kind of question. Autosomal DNA testing examines genetic material inherited from both parents across multiple generations. Autosomal DNA testing produces a percentage breakdown of ancestry by continental region and, with increasing precision, by specific population group within those regions. Y chromosome DNA, passed from father to son with minimal change across generations, allows researchers to trace a direct paternal line. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child regardless of sex, traces the direct maternal line in the same way. Used together, these tools can reach through the genealogical wall in ways that no document ever could. For African American ancestry research specifically, autosomal DNA testing has become the most powerful instrument available. Reference databases have expanded significantly since the early 2000s, incorporating genetic samples from populations across West Africa, Central Africa, and the Horn of Africa. Where earlier testing could identify only broad continental ancestry, modern analysis can now point to specific regional and ethnic populations: the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Fula, the Mandinka, with a degree of precision that was not possible a generation ago. The research into Marshall's ancestry drew on this expanding toolkit. Genealogical projects and genetic studies examining African American figures from the Chesapeake region applied autosomal testing to identify the proportional mix of ancestry across continental populations, cross-referencing results against documentary sources wherever those sources existed. Freedmen's Bureau records, probate files, and the handful of surviving plantation documents from Maryland and Virginia were examined alongside the genetic data, each source testing and informing the other. The methodology was designed from the outset to do more than confirm what was already suspected. It was designed to reach the places where documentary evidence had always failed, to identify ethnic origins that no census had recorded, to detect ancestry that no family story had preserved, and to find the genetic evidence of individuals whom the historical record had chosen not to name. The samples were analyzed, the results came back, and they did not return a simple answer. The largest component of Marshall's ancestry, as the genetic analysis confirmed, was African, not a general continental category, but a finding with regional and ethnic specificity that documents had never been able to provide. The primary signals pointed to West and Central Africa, consistent with the patterns of the transatlantic slave trade that fed the Chesapeake labor system across the 17th and 18th centuries. Maryland and Virginia drew the majority of their enslaved population from a corridor stretching along the West African coast and into the Congo Basin, and Marshall's DNA placed his ancestors within that geography with a precision no plantation record had ever achieved. Among the specific population groups reflected in the genetic markers were ancestry connected to the Yoruba of present-day Nigeria and to peoples of present-day Cameroon and the Congo region. These were not vague affiliations. They were identifiable ethnic communities with distinct histories, languages, and social structures, communities that the slave trade had deliberately fragmented, separating individuals from their kin, their languages, and any documentary trace of who they had been before the Middle Passage. The significance of this specificity is difficult to overstate. For generations, the story of African American ancestry had been forced into abstraction by the absence of records. Families knew they were African. They did not know, and could not know through documents alone, which part of Africa, which people, which lineage. The genetic analysis restored a degree of that specificity. It did not return names, it did not reconstruct the individuals who made the crossing, but it identified the human communities from which Marshall's maternal and paternal African lines had descended, placing him within a history that was specific rather than generic. That history ran directly through the Chesapeake slave system, one of the most extensively documented and most brutal regional slave economies in North America. Marshall's DNA placed his ancestors inside it, not as abstractions, but as members of identifiable ethnic communities forcibly removed from West and Central Africa and absorbed into a system designed to erase exactly the kind of identity the genetic record had just restored. The African ancestry was the foundation, but the analysis had not finished. The European ancestry in Marshall's DNA was not a surprise in the way that a genuinely unexpected finding surprises. It was the kind of confirmation that arrives already half known, carrying weight, not because it is unknown, but because it is now undeniable. Significant European ancestry appears in the genetic profiles of a substantial majority of African Americans whose families trace to the antebellum South and the border states, not because of voluntary intermingling across racial lines, but because of what slavery made possible and what the law declined to prevent. The markers pointed primarily toward ancestry from the British Isles, including English and Scots-Irish genetic signatures consistent with the planter class that dominated Maryland and Virginia through the colonial and antebellum periods. These were the families who owned the land, controlled the courts, wrote the laws, and held legal title to the people whose labor built the economy. Their DNA entered the African American lineage through coercion. The historical record is unambiguous on this point, even when it declines to name the individuals responsible. Marshall himself had indicated as much. His remark about carrying the meanest slave owners in his bloodline was not speculation. It was, as the genetic evidence now confirmed, an accurate reading of his own history, one he had arrived at through intuition and family awareness, long before any laboratory result was available to confirm it. The weight of that confirmation is not abstract. Marshall spent his professional life arguing before courts that the legal system of the United States had been constructed to protect the interests of one class of people at the direct expense of another. He documented it in briefs, demonstrated it through precedent, and won the argument in the most consequential civil rights case in American legal history. The European ancestry in his DNA is the biological record of the class he argued against, carried inside the man who defeated them in court. That is not irony in the literary sense. It is the specific cellular record of what American history produced, and the analysis had not yet finished producing its findings. The third finding was the one that documentary research had never suggested and oral tradition had never preserved. Alongside the West and Central African ancestry and the British Isles European markers, the genetic analysis identified a measurable percentage of Indigenous American ancestry in Marshall's profile. It was not a trace amount attributable to statistical noise or database limitation. It was a distinct genetic signal, identifiable and consistent, pointing to ancestry from the original inhabitants of the North American continent. Indigenous ancestry in African American families from the Chesapeake and Upper South regions is not without historical precedent, but it is frequently underdocumented and poorly understood. It tends to enter family lines through one of two pathways. The first pathway is intermarriage and long-term contact between free Black communities and remnant indigenous populations during the 17th and 18th centuries, a period when both groups occupied the margins of colonial society and sometimes formed lasting social bonds. The second pathway is the presence of indigenous people who were themselves enslaved during the early colonial period before African chattel slavery became the dominant labor system, and who lived and had children alongside African captives within the same plantations and households. Maryland and Virginia had substantial indigenous populations before European contact. The Piscataway Confederacy controlled much of the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. The Nanacoke occupied the eastern shore. Numerous smaller Algonquian-speaking groups maintained territories throughout the region. By the mid-18th century, epidemic disease, displacement, and colonial violence had dramatically reduced these populations, but their descendants had not disappeared. Many had merged into free black and mixed communities, carrying indigenous ancestry forward through generations that no longer identified formally as native and left no tribal records to mark the connection. Marshall's DNA carried that connection forward into the 20th century, attached to a man whose family had preserved no memory of it. The genetic signal did not offer a tribal name or a specific community, but it confirmed that one of his ancestral lines reached back to the people who had inhabited the Chesapeake before any European or African arrived. 3 lines, 3 histories, one man who walked into the Supreme Court carrying all of them. Genetic ancestry testing can reach through the genealogical wall that documents cannot penetrate. What it cannot do is attach names to the individuals it finds on the other side. The European ancestry in Marshall's DNA confirms that one or more of his ancestors was fathered by a white man operating within or adjacent to the slaveholding system of Maryland or Virginia. It cannot identify who that man was. The documentary record offers no reliable assistance. The children born to enslaved women and white men were recorded, when they were recorded at all, under the name of the mother's enslaver, with the biological father absent from every official document by design. Absence was not an oversight. It was a legal and social architecture maintained with deliberate consistency. Acknowledging paternity across racial lines would have complicated inheritance claims, threatened property arrangements, and undermine the ideological foundations of a racial order that depended on clean categorical separation. The law had no interest in recording what actually happened in the cabins and quarters of American plantations, and so it did not. Indigenous ancestry raises parallel questions without equivalent answers. The genetic signal is clear enough to confirm the ancestry exists. It is not specific enough to identify which community, which individuals, or under what circumstances the connection was formed, whether through free intermarriage, through the shared condition of early colonial enslavement, or through some other form of contact that the historical record did not think worth preserving. The name, the place, and the story behind that line are gone in the same way that the European father's name is gone. They were not lost accidentally, but removed systematically by a society that assigned documentary value selectively. What the DNA confirms, taken in full, is that Marshall's ancestry was shaped by every major structural force in American colonial and antebellum history. The transatlantic slave trade brought his African ancestors to the Chesapeake. The sexual violence embedded in the institution of slavery introduced European ancestry into his line. The displacement and absorption of indigenous peoples into the colonial margins contributed the third strand. All 3 forces operated on people who were never meant to be remembered individually. Marshall remembered them collectively, without knowing their names every time he walked into a courtroom. Marshall argued Brown versus the Board of Education before the Supreme Court in 1952 and 1953, and won the decision in 1954. The ruling declared racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional, dismantling the legal foundation of separate but equal that had governed American public life since Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. It was the culmination of a legal strategy Marshall had pursued for 2 decades through the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, built case by case, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, across a country that had written its laws to exclude the people he represented. In 1967, Lyndon Johnson appointed Marshall to the Supreme Court itself. He became the first African-American justice in the history of that institution, sitting on the same court before which he had argued as an attorney, ruling on the same body of law he had spent his career challenging from the outside. Viewed through the lens of what the DNA revealed, Marshall's career acquires a dimension that biography alone cannot fully capture. He was descended from Africans brought to the Chesapeake in chains, from the European men who in all likelihood enslaved them, and from indigenous people displaced by the colonial project that made the entire system possible. He carried in his own cells the the three populations whose subjugation the American legal order had been constructed to maintain and legitimize. And he used that legal order, its language, its precedents, its procedures, to dismantle the architecture of their oppression. His own words point toward this. Marshall said he was not an integrationist, but a constitutionalist. He believed the Constitution contained promises that it had never genuinely extended to the people it was written to exclude. His ancestry, confirmed now by science, places him among the most direct descendants of that exclusion: the African line, the European line, the Indigenous line. Each represents a community the Constitution failed. Marshall spent his life arguing that the failure was not inherent to the document, but to the men who had applied it selectively. The DNA did not make him a more significant figure. It made the significance more specific. And specificity, in history as in law, is where the truth actually lives. The DNA confirmed what the documents had buried, and what Marshall himself had half-sensed: that he carried every strand of American history inside him, including the ones that history had preferred not to name. The individuals behind the European and indigenous percentages remained unrecoverable. Their names were not recorded because the system that shaped their lives had no interest in preserving them. What survived instead was the man those unnamed lives produced, who walked into the highest court in the country and argued successfully that the law owed more than it had ever given.